English translation 495th contact, Monday, 14th June 2010, 14:58 hours.
There you are, good friend Ptah. Welcome and greetings. Then we may as well get down to business, which is why I have asked Florina to inform you, so that you can come here and we can discuss the matter.
My greetings also to you, Edward, dear friend. As Florina explained to me, the problem that arises is the statutes for the National Group of Germany. I asked you to make a copy of the statutes you have already drafted. Florina took them in your workroom and brought them to me, so I brought them with me. This is basically Ketzel's job, so I talked to him about it. But he will appear here himself in a few minutes, after which we can discuss the matter together. He is still working out a few things in his flying apparatus that you need to know. It is not necessary for you to write down everything according to the conversation, because it is sufficient if you handwrite down the necessary changes or additions in the draft, so that Bernadette can finish the whole thing.
Good, well, we will just have to be patient. And until Ketzel is published, we have some time to give you this article here to read. I would love to hear your opinion. It was Ketzel, my greeting and my welcome.
It is a pleasure for me to also greet you and to see that you are well.
Your visit has a rarefied value. The more I am pleased that you are here today with Ptah. It would also be nice if all the others I know and have not seen for a long time would come here again. I am always happy when someone comes, even if it is not official, and therefore also no reports of conversations are written. Also, the purely private visits always make me very happy.
These purely private visits we also continue to maintain.
Then we should now discuss the things that Ta and I came here for. First of all, I have to point out a serious mistake that has crept into the statutes and the bylaws and which has been overlooked, unfortunately not only by you, but also by me. The mistake only came to my attention when I was working through these new copies. I noticed the mistake because it says non-profit status under paragraph 2 in the draft copy. This prompted me to look in the statutes and bylaws because the non-profit status of the FIGU Association is not officially given. Correctly, the FIGU Association is a non-profit association, which was already established in the statutes on the 17th of June 1978, according to the rules of 1975, when you laid the foundation stone of the FIGU Association at Wiehaldenstrasse 10 in Hinwil. Unfortunately, when I checked the statutes and bylaws, I then found in them the error of non-profit status. This error was inserted by Dr. Joseph Meier, after which the statutes and bylaws were rewritten in 1996. This error must be corrected immediately, because it is not the right to call the association FIGU in the statutes and bylaws as non-profit, if it is not in an officially recognized form. The FIGU Association is non-profit making, and it must also be called so, even if it serves non-profit making purposes, as firstly, by spreading the mission, and secondly, by your private actions, in that you support from your own financial means 2 old people's homes and a marginalized group with fruits and potions. But the whole thing is not officially recorded in writing and therefore not confirmed.
Last Saturday I came across this in the draft statutes for the FIGU National Group Germany. Therefore, I immediately asked Bernadette to correct the lapse in the statutes and bylaws. But what is to be said now about what I had told Bernadette to insert here before the National Group statutes, as Ptah and I had discussed?
This is correct, and according to the way it should actually be. Now we have here, however, various things that need to be put right, but we have to talk about them, which will take time.
I realize that. Ta also said that I should insert the necessary handwritten text in the original.
At least you can do that with the most important things, but we also have to give you explanations, which you do not have to put down in writing. So let us begin.
Man, you two have a lot to say. How much longer do you think we are going to be? It is already 1640 HRs, and I should have been over in the kitchen by now, because I have arranged to meet Marianne and Willem at 16 Meier hours to correct the Goblet of the Truth, the English correction.
Then you should fulfill your obligation to do so, and we will wait here for your return. Then we can finish our work.
I agree with that.
It will probably be 18 hours before I can be back here.
We are not in much of a hurry today. So we will wait for you.
Good, we will see you then. Also have 2 or 3 quick questions.
There will also be plenty of time for that.
Here I am again. I just grabbed a quick bite to eat after the correction work.
These are things we need to discuss. 30 minutes should do it.
Then the facts are clear. Now, if you can really spare some time, I would like to bring up my questions.
For my part, I want to leave now and say goodbye. Farewell, my dear friend. We will meet again sometime.
Also, dear friend, and also goodbye, and many thanks for your efforts and advice. Take care.
While you were doing the correction work, I read your article that is filed here, which I consider valuable, and I want to say that it will be necessary for you to publish it in a bulletin so that many Earth humans read it and remember everything usefully.
Good, because I was going to give it to you to read anyway. So I will also include it here in our conversation.
Happiness, Gavolt, and other behavioral patterns of the human beings.
Happiness and violence, as well as all other patterns of human beings' behavior, are highly contagious and thus determine the behavior of family members, friends, acquaintances, groups, and of small and large masses of human beings. The behavior of one individual can infect many others, because human brains, respectively, the thoughts arising from consciousness and the resulting feelings, can infect each other. The correspondingly diverse forms of behavior, which are built up from thoughts and the resulting feelings, range from joy, harmony, love, peace, freedom, happiness, and violence to hatred, revenge, retribution, murder, and suicide. The infection from brain to brain, from consciousness to consciousness respectively, from thought to thought, and from feeling to feeling works like a virus attack, which is why we can also speak of thought viruses and feeling viruses, but this is only a comparison. All behavior patterns of human beings have an infectious effect on their fellow human beings and can spread like an epidemic, or in the worst case, even like a pandemic. Infection occurs through the spreading of views and opinions, as well as through thoughts and feelings, deeds and actions that are perceived and appropriated by human beings. Consequently, the infection results from the uncontrolled adoption or acceptance of other human beings' views, opinions, thoughts, feelings, actions, deeds, actions, and other forms of behavior, respectively, which are also carried out and maintained. And depending on how human beings perceive their self-responsibility and self-control, the incubation period of the thought-feeling virus infection until the outbreak lasts shorter or longer. If, however, self-responsibility and self-control is cultivated to the best possible extent, a reaction to the virus attack can be a long time in coming or, in the very best case, not at all. However, the rule of thumb for human beings on Earth is that they are only too happy to be infected by the behavior of their fellow human beings. It is not important whether this happens in a direct or indirect way. directly from human being to human being or over many corners and distances, via media through newspaper reports, radio or television broadcasts, telephone calls or rumors and slander, etc., it is a fact that the manifold behaviors of human beings, be it love, hatred, thoughts and feelings of contentment, dissatisfaction, freedom, peace, harmony and revenge, retribution, happiness, fierceness, gentleness, courage, fear and cowardice, as well as war, dishonesty, aggressiveness, and violence, etc., spread to human beings like an infectious disease. With regard to all these factors, there is a very high potential for infection among the human beings of the earth, because they are oriented towards the behavioral impulses of others, assimilate them, and thus make them their own. The truth is that dissatisfied human beings are grumpy, hostile, malicious, aggressive, and often even violent towards others, seeking revenge, and are full of hatred and cold feelings, unscrupulous, disharmonious, and hostile. Satisfied human beings, however, meet others with love, peace, harmony, joy, freedom, generosity, and helpfulness, as well as with compassion, etc. This behavior usually causes an increased dopamine release in the brain, which stimulates and strengthens their feeling of happiness and leads to the same patterns of behavior that are shown to them. The patterns of behavior can be very diverse, as has already been explained, and even patterns are transmitted that are hardly considered possible. So when thoughts and feelings and actual forms of behavior are transferred from a human being to fellow human beings respectively, have such an infectious effect, like bacteria and viruses, that infect illnesses, then it is also true that much more is the case. It is obvious that in this way, also behavioral patterns are transmitted, such as cosmetic surgery, sports, needs and obesity, as well as religious and sectarian beliefs, fanaticism, extremism, destructive fury, recklessness, wantonness, and the injuring or killing of human beings and animals, etc. If human beings are like this, in whose circle others live who are addicted to these things, then the probability increases that they themselves are also infected by it and are also addicted to the same things and live them out. In fact, newspaper, radio, and television broadcasts describing such things are enough for human beings to become infected by them and then to adapt their behavior accordingly. The infection, that is to say contagion, occurs simply because human beings imitate the behavior patterns, that is to say habits of others, and adopt them themselves. The own perception changes drastically, and through this, the behavior pattern of others is accepted and made one's own. In this way, human beings hammer into themselves a view or opinion, as well as thoughts and feelings, which fundamentally do not correspond to their own, but are accepted and imitated. Thus, unconsciously and subconsciously, patterns of behavior arise, which do not only have an effect on the individual human being, but which even cause a social, respectively a general infection. Consequently, whole groups or small and large masses of people are affected. Human beings are thus infected by the thoughts and feelings and by the behavior patterns of others as by a contagious disease virus, whereby the patterns of love and happiness, of joy, freedom and harmony, etc., range from dissatisfaction, revenge and retribution to evil, violence and murder. All these, and also all other patterns of behavior mentioned so far, have an infectious effect like bacteria and viruses, but the incubation period from infection to outbreak varies in length depending on the character and personality, as well as the self-responsibility and self-control of the human being. Usually only seconds in the fast case, but in the slower case it is much longer than with an infectious disease. If violence is now specifically assumed along with all other behavioral patterns, then it follows that a human being who experiences it personally runs a very high risk of committing a violent act himself sooner or later. The possibility of committing an act of violence is more than twice as high as it is for a human being who has not experienced violence. The experience of violence does not even have to have taken place in one's own body, but it is sufficient if violence is witnessed. It is a fact that every violent crime, like any other pattern of behavior, triggers a real cascade of subsequent violence. If a human being experiences a violent confrontation, be it on his own body or just by observing it, then this has much more influence on future violent tendencies of a human being than it is the case with all other manifold factors, respectively patterns of behavior, because violence is the worst form of behavior a human being can be affected by. If children are confronted with violence due to a wrong upbringing or environmental circumstances, then this usually follows them all their lives, so they become violent again and again. It is a fact that even poverty, alcohol, drugs, and medication only play a subordinate role compared to one's own life of violence. Violence is indeed contagious, and in a way that infects the brain as if it were a dangerous virus, because every experience of violence is stored in the brain, whether it is experienced and lived out in one's own body or just passively observed. In the brain, respectively, in the amygdala, in the emotional memory center, the traumatic experience and the experience of violence is anchored, which results in the fact that this memory is used in a critical situation and is used to exert violence itself. This is precisely because the stored memory is geared to the fact that a critical or dangerous situation can be resolved by violence. And if a crisis situation actually occurs, then the violence-infected person automatically exerts violence in some way, snaps and strikes. But this happens faster and more radically than a human being who has not yet had an active or passive experience of violence can do. Not only violence is contagious, as has already been explained, but also fear, abdominal pain, sweating, shortness of breath, loneliness, happiness, love, crying, laughing, joy and jealousy, as well as suicide, obesity, murder, sports, greed, torture and torment, smoking, non-smoking, greed, pain and stinginess, etc., and all kinds of thoughts and feelings and all the patterns of behavior mentioned earlier. Regarding suicide, suicide is as contagious as a flu epidemic, although in the age of the internet, this has taken on a global dimension. Those who commit suicide through internet connections do so through contact with like-minded people who do not know each other personally. This proves that social contagion obviously does not require personal contact to be effective. Thoughts, feelings, behavior patterns, and even diseases can also be spread via online networks, so the future looks very bleak in this respect. Of course, the rapidly growing online networks do not increase the infection potential itself, but they do ensure that a much faster infection and a faster worldwide spread of a thought-feeling epidemic and behavioral pattern epidemic occurs. Through the internet, thousands and even hundreds of thousands of human beings can thus be infected by a thought, feeling, and behavior virus in a very short time and trigger a dangerous behavior pattern pandemic, the dynamics of which are not to be found in any flu epidemic. Even deaths can occur due to the failure of internal organs, as a nocebo effect, which occurs when corresponding patterns of thoughts and feelings act on human beings through thoughts and feelings and trigger the corresponding lethal factors. These can all spread like an epidemic among human beings and be contagious, thus creating mass infections, as it were, and the social network of society plays a very important role in this. And that this is indeed the case is proven time and again. For example, by football fanaticism, as well as by hooligan and demonstration shows and extremist neo-Nazi groups, terrorist suicide bombers and religious sectarian mass suicides, etc. It is only through some sort of predetermined pattern of behavior of an individual or several human beings that it is possible for thoughts and feelings to develop into viruses which, like poisonous pathogens, quickly spread and infect others. Thus, in the way that human beings assume and imitate the behavior patterns of others, one brain can infect other brains, whereby the incubation period from infection to outbreak can happen within seconds, but can also last longer, as has already been explained. The symptoms that occur can last for minutes, hours or days, even weeks, months and years, or even the whole life. With regard to the fact that a human being is infected with violence, a passive experience of violence in childhood is sufficient, as already explained, in which an act of violence is therefore only observed. Basically, the virus-like transfer of behavior patterns from one human being to another is often a very serious epidemic. This is especially the case when it is a matter of mass hysteria, from which very unpleasant and dangerous consequences can arise. A mass infection in this way is like a dangerous disease, in which human beings are infected by thoughts, feelings, emotions, and behavior patterns, whether they are negative or positive. The brain with consciousness is the decisive factor, because that is where the whole thing comes from. Basically, the human brain is a social organ in which structures are created that adapt relatively quickly to other human beings and their behavior patterns. Particularly in emotionally strong, stressful, and emotional situations, the human brain uses every opportunity and possibility to share its own work with other brains of fellow human beings. It is a fact that when two human beings meet, their brains throw out their biochemical grappling hooks and build bridges between them. In this way, they save energy on the one hand, and on the other hand, these bridges pave the way for social contagion of moods and behaviors, regardless of whether the human beings in question are stable or unstable in terms of health. In this way, social networks with family members, partners, friends and acquaintances, as well as with strangers, lead to brain connections, which then form the key to joy, happiness, and sociability, as well as to joylessness, unhappiness, and loneliness, etc. Loneliness, however, has nothing to do with being alone, as many human beings confuse and misunderstand. Loneliness is a state of being alone for oneself, in which a human being is alone because he wants to be alone or has to be alone. Loneliness, on the other hand, is based on the fact that human beings have thoughts and feelings that make them separate them from all external influences, make them feel alone and abandoned, and do not cultivate any connecting contacts with their fellow human beings. Depending on the thoughts and feelings, one human being feels lonely more often and more quickly than another, whereby acceptance and imitation also play a very important role. Especially very sensitive human beings feel lonely very quickly, often because they feel misunderstood by others and feel that they have been treated wrongly and trivially. This leads them to isolate themselves from the environment and to go away in cloudy, evil thoughts and feelings, which of course promotes their state of loneliness even more. But not enough with that, because even if it sounds paradoxical, the radiated loneliness acts like a poisonous virus on the fellow men. Consequently, the whole thing is transferred to them. And the worst thing about it is that it is precisely where the interpersonal contacts are very close, such as in the family, in the circle of friends and acquaintances, or in a smaller or larger group of human beings, that the symptoms of loneliness are expressed very strongly and have a contagious effect. As a result, loneliness can spread within a group or in society like a nasty ulcer. For as soon as a human being feels lonely within a family, circle of friends or acquaintances, or in a smaller or larger group, the risk increases that others will also slowly but surely begin to feel lonely, with the risk of others being infected being over 50%. The whole thing creates a kind of cycle of isolation, and when a human being feels lonely, he inevitably behaves negatively towards others. This usually leads to a situation where, if there is not an infection, the other people turn away from the lonely human beings, whereby those who turn away are naturally disappointed, but this has the negative effect that they then unconsciously begin to avoid the lonely human being and treat him unfairly. In this way, many friendships break up, not only direct contacts, but gradually the whole social network is infected by it and falls into bad ways. Sim Yasay, Silver Star Center, 29th May 2010, 00:26 hours. Billy.
But now I would still like to ask you what your scribes and linguists have said about what is correct in the naming of times. Should the time after midnight until 9 o'clock in the morning be written with 00 before the hour or not? Or is it only the number of hours that is sufficient? By this I mean whether, for example, 2:19 hours should simply be written or 02:19 HARs? That for the first hour after midnight you have to write 00 or 00.10 hours is clear to me, because the first hour has to run through and become full, because of the running 60 minutes. But if the first hour is full, what should be then? Does it have to be 01:05 hours respectively, 02.08 hours, etc., or just 1:05 hours respectively, 2:08 hours, etc.?
Our scholars explain that there is no doubt that before the number of hours after midnight until the first full hour, there must be 2 zeros before the number of minutes because the hour is not yet full. However, if the hour, like every other hour, is also full with the 60 minutes that have elapsed, then the 0 is omitted because there are not any more minutes before the hour number that still have to elapse. Only after the number of hours, the minutes start to run again. So after the first hour of the night after midnight, for example, it is calculated and spoken of 1:41 hours or 2:10 HRs, but not of 01:05 hours or 02:42 HRs. This fact corresponds to simple logic, just as it does in relation to the designation of months, so that there is only a second or third month, etc., but never a 02nd or 03rd month, etc., because in the current month in question, the number is not preceded by any other denominator. If, however, a 0 is used to do this anyway, then this is illogical, because there is not another month in the current month. So the same principle applies as for time, because a month can only be named with its actual numerical value 1, 2, or 3, or with 10, 11, or 12 respectively, without a 0 being allowed to be placed in front of it. If this is done, however, it corresponds to illogicity and a complete lack of understanding of reality.
This is plausible and reasonable, and I can relate to it. But whether the know-it-alls also understand this is questionable.
Logic and understanding are not the strength of every human being.
Which you probably are right. But something else. Simya say. You and Quetzal once said something about an earthly plant that is supposed to help against depression. Unfortunately, I cannot remember which plant it was that was mentioned.
It is the St. John's wort. If an extract is obtained from this medicinal plant, it usually works better than chemical, respectively synthetic antidepressants. In the case of depression, it is to be understood that there is an endorphin deficiency. Poor nutrition can lead to depression because the body is deprived of important nutrients. Trace elements, vitamins, and minerals, as well as enzymes, etc., must, of course, be taken into account.
Someone gave me a few cans of stevia, but you once said that this natural sweetener is unhealthy, as are artificial sweeteners and refined sugar.
The sweetener extracted from the sweet plant Stevia rebandhiana is actually just as harmful to health and therefore carcinogenic as the various artificial sweeteners. And indeed, the refined white sugar is not harmless either. These are used to influence cancer cells. The more glucose they get, the more their growth is stimulated and promoted.
Then I want to ask another question about the oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico. Florina told me that the BP company, the British Petroleum Company, is spreading incredible falsehoods about the real output of petroleum into the Gulf and all that evil.
That is correct, because from the very beginning, more than 8.6 million liters of petroleum flowed into the Gulf, whereas the current amount is about 14.5 million liters per day. However, this quantity can increase rapidly over time due to greater pressure from the depths. This depends on the corresponding interterrestrial conditions. Geothermal energy and natural gases also play an important role. And this can happen if measures are not taken within a reasonable time to prevent this even greater evil. At present, however, it is questionable whether the BP company will be able to accomplish what is necessary to bring everything under control within a reasonable period of time. And if it is not possible to stop the flow of oil, then the whole thing could under certain circumstances mean that petroleum will continue to contaminate the Gulf, and thus ultimately also the Gulf Stream to a large extent, which could then lead to a global climate catastrophe that far surpasses anything we have seen to date in terms of climate change. The leaked petroleum is already causing new climatic changes, which are already making themselves felt. But this is also being concealed, as is the fact that the enormous quantities of petroleum emit toxic gases and particles, which enter the troposphere and atmosphere and are driven and rained down by the winds around the globe. If in the end, the poisonous petroleum of the Earth drifts north with the Gulf Stream and contaminates the Atlantic Ocean, then enormous climatic changes will occur, whereas the ones that have occurred so far would only be a weak prelude. In addition, poisonous substances in the form of poisonous gases and poisonous particles are released from the Earth's petroleum, which have a pathogenic effect on human beings and on all animals, but how these poisonous substances are also distributed in the seawater itself and deposited on the seabed, whereby further contamination occurs, which is also concealed by those responsible and by scientists. The Earth petroleum that shoots up does not only float on the water and contaminate the surface as well as the land that is affected by it, but it also floats underwater as oil clumps.
It is not very pleasant. But do you have any data on the total amount of oil consumed per day?
According to our investigations, it is about 14,000,000 liters per day.
Enormous.
It really is.
And now, if all the sap in the Gulf shoots up from the deep, there's no stopping it. And unfortunately, you are not allowed to help to close the leak.
As you know, we are not allowed to interfere in any earthly matters. And unfortunately, the operators of such oil rigs do not have the necessary technology to prevent such disasters or repair them when they occur. This is an incomprehensible irresponsibility, which is why the whole thing should be banned and replaced by renewable energies. That governments allow such drilling for petroleum in the seas is incomprehensible and criminal. In fact, such action should be prohibited.
Such a ban is unlikely to come about because all of technology and the economy is still dependent on oil. But perhaps Barack Obama will succeed in getting people to start considering natural and renewable resources. Because now, he is also involved in the oil issue as a government official. He can encourage that in this way the necessary energy is created. I am thinking mainly of electricity, which can also replace internal combustion engines if the necessary technology is finally created, and if there is not always speculation with oil, and therefore with petrol and diesel oil. Renewable energies would also be possible, but since rather the whole thing has been lost because it was thought that petroleum could be extracted forever. But it was also only managed for immeasurable profit, but not to promote all the necessary new and non-damaging drive technology, etc.
That is correct, but unfortunately, electrical engineering and also renewable energy technology is still not being promoted enough in this sense.
Since the 1960s, medicine and everything else is dependent on oil, also plastics and so on. The entire world economy and the transportation of food to all corners of the globe can also only function through the use of oil. Globalization has brought enormous damage and disadvantages for mankind and the world. And perhaps the only way to change all this for the better is to find back to ecological forms and systems, and to use them again.
That would indeed be the desirable and correct solution. But the greed for profit of the Earth humans does not allow this.
Sadly, this is indeed so. We have already talked about electrosmog several times, as it is caused by mobile phones, etc. But on the other hand, the manufacturers of appliances and the specialist lamps, they claim that the radiation is harmless. In contrast to this, however, you have said the following several times, for example, at the 330th Contact Conversation on the 29th of August 2002.
Electrosmog is not invigorating for all life forms, but very harmful, whereby human beings in particular are very susceptible to it, along with pets and wild animals and plants. Electrosmog fields occur everywhere where electrical lines run, or where electrical apparatuses, plants, generators, or transformer stations, etc. are located. Also radio, television, and mobile phone transmitters, as well as similar receivers, that is to say, radio telephones, radio installations, and mobile phones, respectively, the so-called mobile phones, emit strong emissions of electrosmog, which is nothing else than low-energy electromagnetic fields, respectively low-energy electromagnetic oscillations. Effects of electrosmog on human beings can be, for example, dizziness, consciousness disorders, headaches, brain warming, concentration disorders, allergies, blood diseases, rheumatism, nervous diseases, psyche damage, eating disorders as well as aggressions, sleep disorders, forgetfulness, personality changes, depressions, visual disorders, even cancer, etc., as the facts show. But this is usually as vehemently disputed elsewhere by the earthly experts and scientists, as well as by the manufacturers of the products emitting electrosmog.
On another occasion, you also explained that the radiation emitted by mobile phones, etc., also destroys cells in the body, and that changes occur in the genetic material, which also causes damage to pregnancies and physical deformities, as well as conscious damage to offspring. You also said that the radiation warms the brain and changes the blood count, causing platelets to clump together. All this is still denied by the mobile phone manufacturers and their purchased experts, and consequently false test results are delivered. And then there is the question of whether the time has not finally come when all this deception and lies will be exposed.
It will not be the case for quite some time yet that really serious research is being done in this matter and that unadulterated results are being published which also really correspond to the truth. For the manufacturers of equipment and apparatus and for the experts who are supposed to investigate and clarify everything, profit takes precedence, and they are indifferent to the health of human beings. But now, Edward, it is time for me to go again, because it has already got late. Goodbye, my friend, and if it is possible for me, I will come next Saturday for the correction work. On Wednesday, Thursday, or Friday, I will let you know through Florina. Goodbye.
It really is already 1925 Chars. How time flies. Take care, Tom, my friend.